The kitchen door creaked open with a sharp blade-like sound, and in that instant the man hunched over with a mop froze his breath, jamming in his chest as if someone were squeezing it shut. Eddie, the name everyone in the restaurant had been using with careless indifference for the past 2 weeks, was not who they thought he was. In the faded janitor uniform, the soft-soled shoes soaked with cleaning chemicals, and the hastily shaved face, no one would ever guess this man once made financial brokers' hands tremble every time they signed a contract. His real identity, Daniel Hartley, 49 years old, founder of Hartley's Flame, had been buried beneath this shell of exhaustion and silence. And now, at the very moment dawn had yet to touch the city, he saw something no manager would ever believe. Someone was here even earlier than the morning shift. Through the fogged round window, Daniel saw Olivia Marquez standing alone in the kitchen like a quiet warrior. The cold white lights reflected off her calm face, yet could not hide the dark circles carved by exhaustion. She seasoned each ribeye with quick, decisive movements, every gesture so precise Daniel felt, as if he were watching a sacred ritual. But what made his blood turn cold was not her skill, but the spice jars on the table. None of them belonged to the Hartley's Flame chain. None of the ingredients matched the standards he himself had once approved. And the dark brown mixture she was rubbing on the meat smelled like coffee. Coffee, the ingredient he once experimented with during the days he slept in the first store, only for the consulting team to dismiss it because it did not maintain process consistency. Olivia was breaking the rules. Yet strangely, Daniel did not feel anger. Instead, a deep discomfort twisted inside him, the unsettling feeling of seeing an old version of himself reflected in her unyielding stance. He raised his phone, snapped a few photos, forcing himself to believe this was evidence of procedural violation. But as he looked closer, he noticed something that made his heart stumble. A receipt sat half-tucked under the cutting board. When Olivia turned toward the refrigerator, Daniel stepped quietly into the kitchen. His fingers trembled as he pulled the paper toward him. Pete's Artisan Spices, $4,782. Mason's Butcher House, $15,600. Haven Market Imports, $8,950. And at the bottom was the familiar signature O. Marquez. She had bought everything with her own money. The realization hit Daniel so hard, he had to brace himself against the counter to stay upright. This was not fraud. This was not personal gain. This was a woman carrying an entire restaurant on her own wallet and her own exhausted shoulders, while he, the man who built this empire, hid in the shadows watching it crumble. "Can I help you with something?" Olivia's voice echoed behind him, cold enough to make the tiled floor feel as if it shrank. Daniel spun around too fast, nearly dropping the receipt. She stood there with her arms crossed, her dark eyes calm to the point of being terrifying. He forced out the broken English with the immigrant accent he had practiced for 2 weeks. I clean. I think trash paper." Olivia stepped forward, plucked the receipt from his hand with 2 fingers, then slipped it into her apron pocket. "That is not trash, Eddie," she said softly, tired, but not weak. "That is an investment." Then she turned away and continued working as if he had never existed. But as Daniel pushed the mop cart out of the kitchen, he caught a glimpse of Olivia's shoulders dropping almost imperceptibly, a silent collapse. Her strength cracked for just a fraction of a second. He recognized that, because he had once been the same. And in that moment, for the first time in years, Daniel Hartley felt he was no longer the owner of this empire. He was just a man lost inside his own dream. And Olivia Marquez, a chef the world saw as insignificant, understood that dream more than anyone else. The investigation Daniel thought he controlled was already slipping through his fingers, curling into a storm that had begun at 5 o'clock in the morning. And he did not yet know that what he had witnessed was only the first spark. What was truly burning was his conscience. Daniel stood pressed against the storage room door, his heartbeat pounding so loudly he could hear it himself. While in the kitchen, Olivia Marquez was bracing herself against a morning worse than anything he had ever witnessed. Noah Benson, the 22-year-old prep cook whose eyes always carried a nervous sheen, stood trembling in front of a tray of steaks, burnt black like coal. The acrid smell rose thick in the air, mixing with the scent of coffee and metal, forming a suffocating haze that made the already tense kitchen feel even tighter. Olivia crossed her arms as she looked at Noah, her voice not loud but sharp enough to silence every chopping sound behind her. He stammered, his voice cracking like glass, explaining that he had forgotten to hit the timer because he had rushed over to help Jorge at the soup station. 12 steaks, nearly $200 worth of product, had turned into a useless pile of charcoal. Daniel knew those numbers would make Greg Harmon, the manager who cared only about cost sheets, explode. But Olivia simply drew a long breath and said calmly that when Greg arrived, she would take the blame. Noah's eyes widened, his face draining of color as he shook his head violently. Olivia rested a hand on his shoulder, gentle in a way that made Daniel's chest tighten. She told him he was the hardest worker in the kitchen, that he deserved the chance to fix his mistake, and that one error could not erase all the good he brought into the room every day. Daniel turned away, shame crashing over him like a breaking wave. He had built a system that treated people as expenses, mistakes, as excuses to cut them loose, and now he was watching a head chef lift her team with compassion, in the very way he had forgotten long ago. Greg entered the kitchen shortly afterward, with his usual irritated expression, the sound of his leather shoes striking the tile sharp and cold. He flipped open his logbook, asked about the lost meat, and Olivia calmly accepted full responsibility. Greg reprimanded her harshly, saying this was the 3rd time in the month, saying that if it happened again, he would recommend the corporate office fire her. Daniel saw Noah's hands clench, saw the flicker of hurt in Olivia's eyes as Greg turned away, but she stayed upright, holding her composure like a final shield. After Greg left the kitchen, Olivia went back to work, as if the threat had never been spoken. Her eyes stayed steady, her hands sure as she seasoned, adjusted the flames, and tasted each dish before calling for pass. From his spot cleaning beneath the counter, Daniel watched the entire kitchen move around her like she was the central axis. No one said it aloud, but they leaned on her to keep everything from collapsing. She led with calm instead of shouting, with clear expectations instead of fear. When opening hour arrived, customers flooded in, and tickets began sliding down in rapid succession. Olivia transformed into a different version of herself, fast, precise, almost artistic. She tasted every plate, adjusted the color of a sauce, with a tilt of her wrist wiped the rim of a dish with the kitchen towel tucked into her apron, then called orders with a clarity that made the whole kitchen move like a well-tuned machine, but still very human. When a server returned saying Table 12 had praised it as the best steak they had eaten in years, Daniel saw a faint tremor at the corner of Olivia's mouth. Not a smile, but a rare shard of light. Another server reported that Table 8 had asked about the marinade, because it reminded them of the early days when Hartley's Flame was just a small neighborhood place. Olivia was quiet for a moment, then said, "Family recipe." Hearing that sentence made Daniel's entire body heat up. That recipe was not her family's. It was his, the soul of Hartley's flame, that he had abandoned when he traded the emotions of guests for chain model profit margins. He looked at Olivia, as if seeing a younger version of himself, someone who loved every detail of a dish, loved customers' reactions, loved creating the kind of moment that made people pause and smile. When a family of 4 at table 6 burst into tears because the flavor reminded them of when Hartley's flame still felt warm and genuine, Daniel understood exactly what he had lost. They were not crying because of the food. They were crying because a memory had been awakened, a memory he had forgotten. Daniel stood frozen, feeling as if all the surrounding sounds were being squeezed into silence. He looked at Olivia, a woman the manager dismissed, a woman the system abandoned, a woman he himself had unknowingly pushed into hardship, and he realized he was not just investigating a failing restaurant. He was facing the truth he had avoided for years. Hartley's flame had not lost its soul because the recipe changed. It had lost its soul because he had. And Olivia Marquez was the only one still trying to keep it alive. Daniel left the restaurant when the sky had already turned amber, but his mind was still trapped in the rhythm of knives on cutting boards, in the look in Olivia's eyes when she said it was a family recipe, and in the grateful sobs of diners who had rediscovered a flavor they thought was lost forever. He wandered through the streets of Denver without remembering where he was going. The cold wind slapped against his face, but could not clear his thoughts. Every step felt heavy, as if he were dragging an entire crumbling empire behind him. When he finally sat at a small table by the window of a cafe, his whole body felt chilled, as if he had just stepped out of a walk-in freezer. His phone buzzed relentlessly with emails from the board demanding the Denver branch be shut down to cut losses. They said the costs were too high, the staff inefficient, and the brand dying. And Daniel understood they were right, but not in the way they believed. It was not inefficiency. It was not the burden of expenses. It was not the quality of the ingredients. It was him. He was the one pushing his own creation to the edge. The thought made his heart tighten, as if someone had squeezed it hard. He needed to look deeper, understand more clearly. A small flame flickered inside him, faint but persistent, urging him to return to the place where everything began. The place where he once worked 18 hours a day, slept on a worn leather chair, and seared steaks, with the stubborn conviction of someone who believed a dish could change a person's life. He drove toward Boulder, to where the first restaurant had once stood. When he arrived, the old building was run down, the Hartley's flame sign, nothing more than a dusty shadow of its former self. Daniel stood before the locked door, touched the rough wall, and memories rushed back like a sudden gust of wind, the smoky mesquite aroma, the sizzle of cast iron, the smiles of nameless customers whose names he once remembered, and whom he used to ask if they were having a good day. This place had once been home. Now, it was the tomb of a dream. Daniel opened his laptop inside his car and began digging through old records. Files he once dismissed suddenly felt unbearably heavy. Invoices, timesheets, employee photos. After nearly half an hour, he finally found it: Olivia's file. Hire date March of the year 2014. Position sous chef. Location Hartley's Flame Boulder. Daniel's hand trembled as he opened a folder of photos from that opening day. In the crowded image next to a younger version of himself with a bright smile stood a completely different Olivia. Longer hair, brighter smile, eyes full of hope. She leaned slightly toward him, as if she had found an anchor in the man she believed was a decent leader. Daniel touched the screen, heat rising in his chest, as if someone had ripped open an old wound. He had forgotten her. Forgotten the person who had experimented with marinades beside him, who had argued with him late into the night to adjust a single gram of salt. Forgotten the person who believed in the dream he created longer than he himself did. Scrolling further, he found a wall covered with a sheet of paper scribbled in marker, "You cannot mass produce a soul." The signature beneath it belonged to Olivia. Daniel closed his eyes, feeling as if someone had slapped him hard with the truth. He still believed he was only investigating restaurant quality. But Olivia had never been trying to break the rules. She had been trying to save his soul. In the employee meeting video from the year 2015, he heard his own harsh voice insisting that the system must win over emotion. He heard Olivia trying to defend the original recipe, saying customers loved it because it felt real, not because it was consistent like industrial food. He had laughed. He had waved her off. He had pushed her out of the only place she ever wanted to belong. Daniel opened his browser and searched for Denver's restaurant reviews over the past 3 years. A string of cold words appeared, bland, soulless, not like before, now just another boring chain. But starting 8 months ago, the moment Olivia began purchasing ingredients with her own money, the tone shifted. Tastes like the early days someone is cooking with heart. Do not replace this chef. Daniel rested his hands on the steering wheel and exhaled, as if reclaiming 10 years of lost youth in one breath. He understood then that the problem was not in the food. It was in him, the man who once knew how to touch the souls of his guests, but abandoned that gift for numbers and profit. Olivia remembered. Olivia fought. Olivia kept the flame alive, and he did not. And that truth, painful enough to make breathing difficult, was also his final chance to fix everything before the fire went out for good. Daniel returned to the restaurant in the dim pre-dawn light, not to mop floors, but to finally face what he had avoided for far too long. As he stood outside the kitchen door, 2 voices drifted out and made him freeze. The first was trembling, panicked. The second, calm and precise, carried enough weight to make the entire room pause. Tommy Benson, the 22-year-old line cook Daniel had only seen a few times, was standing hunched over in front of the prep table. In front of him was a tray of 12 steaks, burnt black, like charcoal. Tommy looked as if he might collapse, his hands shaking so violently that his kitchen towel slipped from his fingers. "I will pay for all of it," he choked out. "I swear, I did not mean to." Olivia cut him off, not with anger, but with certainty. "No one is making you pay for anything. Tell me what happened." Tommy drew a deep breath, but a sob shattered the answer. He had forgotten the timer. He had run to help at the soup station because Jorge had cut his hand. And when he returned, it was already too late. Daniel stood frozen in the corner, his heart tightening as if someone were squeezing it. The scene was painfully familiar, not because he had made the same mistake, but because he knew exactly how Greg Harmon would handle it, the way a manager who saw only numbers and never people would react. "Greg is going to kill me," Tommy whispered, eyes red. Olivia shook her head. "Greg will not know." He stared at her, unable to believe what he had heard. But Olivia continued, her voice firm, as steel carrying the instinctive protectiveness of someone who had been crushed by an unfeeling system before. "When he arrives, I will tell him I burned those steaks. I was showing you a new technique and misjudged the time." Tommy let out a broken breath and shook his head, as if refusing the idea of someone taking his mistake onto their shoulders. But why? Olivia looked at him for a long moment. "Because you deserve to learn not to be thrown away. You arrive earliest, you leave last, you help everyone without being asked. You are someone this kitchen needs. One mistake does not define you. Daniel felt his throat close. He, the man who built this entire empire, had never said those words to anyone. He had only looked at numbers, reports, profits. Olivia looked at people. In that moment, Daniel realized she was not just a head chef. She was the soul the entire system needed to stay standing. The sound of Greg's shoes echoed from down the hall, striking the tiles like a gavel, delivering a verdict. Olivia immediately straightened her eyes, returning to their calm, cold focus. Greg walked in with his usual scowl. When he saw the tray of burnt steaks, Daniel noticed the way his eyes lit up the expression of someone thrilled to find a reason to punish. Olivia did not let him speak. I burned them. Greg spun toward her, his face flushing with the satisfaction of having a target. This is the 3rd time this month. Do you have any idea how much this costs? Do you want me to report you to corporate? You are burning money, Olivia. Every sentence was a slash. But Olivia stood still, saying nothing, not dodging, shielding Tommy with a silence stronger than any argument. Daniel saw Tommy's hands gripping the counter so tightly, his knuckles turned white. After Greg stormed out with the threat that one more time and you are fired, the kitchen air sank, as if all the oxygen had been drained away. But Olivia went straight back to work, as if her dignity had not just taken a knife to the chest. Tommy moved faster than before, sharper, trying to redeem himself with every precise movement of a pan. And Daniel, standing hidden in the corner of the kitchen, felt an emotion he had not felt in years: respect. Respect for a woman fighting in ways no one noticed, with patience, sacrifice, and a loyalty to something he himself had abandoned. He looked at Tommy, saved by compassion. He looked at Olivia, crushed by a system he created yet still standing. And he looked at himself, a man who thought he held the most power, only to realize he understood the least. A storm was coming. Daniel felt it in every breath, in every flash of Greg's simmering frustration, in every frame of memory he had unearthed about Olivia the day before. He did not know when it would break, but he knew the eye of that storm was standing right in front of him, Olivia Marquez. A woman dismissed, a woman who seemed small, but carrying a strength capable of saving an entire empire or collapsing it. And he was the one who had placed that fire in her hands. Daniel stepped out of the kitchen after that tense as wire confrontation, but his mind kept circling back to the image of Olivia standing in the middle of the storm, calm, as someone who had long grown used to holding up an entire world alone. He walked without knowing where he was going, until his feet led him to the parking lot behind the restaurant. The early morning wind slipped through his clothes, cold enough to feel like a warning. He sat in his car, opened his laptop, and began digging through old files, not as a CEO seeking numbers, but as a man trying to understand how his dream had become distorted. The folders were thick with dates, reports, proposals, and emails. Most were things he had signed without ever reading carefully. Marketing memos about mainstreaming recipes to fit the chain model, cost-cutting requests from operations, proposals to switch to cheaper suppliers to maximize profit. What he once considered smart strategy now felt like he had personally strangled his own creation. Then he opened the photo folders from the early days of Hartley's Flame. And there, Olivia appeared in every corner, not as an employee, but as an invisible pillar. She stood beside him as they tested the 17th version of the marinade. She beamed when customers praised their very first ribeye. She had notebook pages filled with sharp, insightful notes written in tiny letters. And in the last photo from the 2015 staff meeting, she stood slightly apart, her eyes no longer bright. That was the moment he had begun signing chain expansion contracts deals with investors that required him to dilute the brand's identity in exchange for speed. Olivia had seen what he refused to see. When Daniel opened an old staff meeting video, the air inside the car seemed to freeze. He heard his own voice from 10 years earlier, calm, cold, and full of the confidence of a man who believed he was building an empire. The system must win over emotion. We need to standardize in order to scale. He heard Olivia challenge him. And what about the soul of the food? What about the feeling that brings customers back because they feel cared for? He saw himself dismissing her. And he saw the moment Olivia shifted from dreamer to realist, the moment she understood that the dream was no longer shared. It had become a machine, and he was the one operating it. When the video ended, Daniel sat motionless, feeling hollow, as if he were standing inside the old restaurant on the night it closed forever. He opened his browser and searched customer reviews. The words appeared like a verdict, soulless flavor. Tastes like industrial food. No longer Hartley's flame. But when he scrolled down to the past 8 months, something made his heart jolt. The Denver branch reviews had changed completely, just like the early days. Someone is cooking with love. Steak so good it makes you want to cry. This matched the exact time Olivia began buying ingredients out of her own pocket. What he had tried to standardize, she had quietly restored. What he had forgotten, she had preserved alone. What he had lost, she had rebuilt with her own meager salary. Daniel looked at the stack of invoices she had paid with her own money, at her debt records in the personnel files, at the costs she had shouldered on behalf of the entire restaurant. And he understood that Olivia had not only saved the Denver branch, she had saved his legacy, the very thing he had betrayed. A deep, piercing pain ran through him, not the pain of failure, but of regret. Olivia Marquez, the head chef. Greg dismissed the woman the entire system cornered, was the one who understood Hartley's flame better than anyone. And Daniel knew his investigation was no longer about finding faults. It was a journey to uncover the truth about her, about the food, and about himself. When he shut his laptop, the parking lot lay quiet under a thin layer of morning light. And Daniel realized this was no longer a story about a restaurant on the verge of closing. This was the story of a woman who had kept alive the flame he had let go. And if he did not act now, that flame would die this time for good. Daniel arrived at the restaurant earlier than ever, carrying the resolve to speak with Olivia, to lay everything bare, to ask her for a chance to make things right. But the moment he stepped into the back hallway, a pair of voices froze him in place. They were not Olivia's. They belonged to Marcus Hale and Janet Kim, the 2 auditors sent by the board. Both wore gray suits, tablets in hand, standing in the middle of the corridor, as if they belonged there more than the people who had spent half their lives in that kitchen. Greg stood beside them with a look that was half smug, half anxious, the expression of someone who had found the perfect excuse to pin blame on another, but feared being dragged down with them. Janitor Eddie stood in the corner, cloth in hand, head lowered, but Daniel's heart pounded so hard it felt ready to burst. He knew he had caused this. He knew he had triggered the investigation when he suspected Olivia in the early days. And now it was pulling her straight into a lion's den. We received an anonymous report, Marcus said, his voice calm, clinical, like he was reading test results. There are signs of procedural violations, sourcing ingredients outside the system, potential inventory fraud. The words hit the kitchen walls like hammer blows. Daniel felt his chest tighten with a deep, bruising sorrow he could not stop. Janet opened her list eyes, fixed on the screen. "We need to speak with the head chef immediately." Greg rushed to respond. "I will call her. She should explain this herself." For a split second, a flash of malicious satisfaction lit Greg's eyes, the delight of someone who believed he would finally get rid of the person who defied him. Daniel's grip tightened on the mop handle, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to shout that it was all his fault. He wanted to step in and defend Olivia. But he could not. Not in this janitor's uniform. Not when his true identity was the only protection he still had. When Olivia stepped out of the kitchen, Daniel knew she understood exactly what was coming. She stood tall, hands lightly clasped, her eyes steady, even though her lips tensed. Janet began. "According to our records, the Denver branch has ingredient costs 23% higher than company allowance. Can you explain that?" Olivia answered evenly, "I use better ingredients. In return, I reduce waste and improve quality." Marcus cut in. "But not through approved suppliers. These purchases are not in the system. We have invoices from Pete's Artisan Spices, Mason's Butcher House Haven Market imports. All of them are outside company listings." The air thickened. Daniel felt each word fall on Olivia like stones. "But she only said I paid with my personal money." Marcus frowned. "You used your salary to buy supplies for the company." "Yes." Why Olivia did not blink. "Because the ingredients provided by the company are not good enough. Because customers deserve better. Because this restaurant needs to live, not just survive." Greg seized the moment, his voice dripping with reprimand. "That is not your decision to make, Olivia. We need consistency. A recipe is a recipe. A process is a process. You cannot change things on your own." For the first time, Olivia raised an eyebrow. "I changed it because the old recipe was soulless." Silence spread like a shockwave. Then Marcus spoke, his tone cold, as steel chef Marquez. "Do you understand that what you are admitting today constitutes severe policy violations? Supply chain breaches, altering formulas, using personal funds without reporting, interfering with system operations." Olivia stood up, removed her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table. "I understand. I also understand that for the past 3 years I have been trying to preserve something none of you remember. I have been trying to keep the soul of Hartley's flame alive. And I know exactly how this will end." Janet opened her mouth as if to stop her, but Olivia shook her head gently. "There is no need." Greg's eyes widened when he realized what she was about to do. "Do not," Olivia interrupted softly. "I resign." One simple sentence. But it rang through the room like a death sentence. Daniel felt as if someone had punched him in the gut. He wanted to speak, wanted to scream for her to stay, but his feet remained rooted to the floor. Olivia turned and said one more line that stunned everyone into silence. "The real marinade recipe is in the walk-in cooler, in the wooden box. If anyone still cares, use it." She walked back into the kitchen and said goodbye to each person. Tommy nearly broke down when she told him goodbye in a strangely gentle voice. Then the back door closed. Olivia disappeared from the restaurant, from the kitchen, from the world she had been holding up alone. And Daniel stood there in a janitor's uniform, helpless, realizing he did not even have the courage to stop her. And that was the moment he understood what had just happened was not Olivia being punished. It was the heart of Hartley's flame walking out the door. Daniel stood frozen in the corner of the room as the door closed behind Olivia, leaving a cold emptiness spreading through the kitchen that had once been the heartbeat of the restaurant. No one spoke, No one moved. Only the steady rumble of the exhaust fan filled the silence like a long, exhausted sigh. A few staff members lowered their heads. Noah lifted a hand to cover his face, and Greg tried to maintain his usual composure, though his eyes flickered with the dawning realization that what he had just driven away was not merely a chef, but the pulse of the entire restaurant. Daniel turned away and walked outside, slipping into the parking lot like a man running from himself. He tried calling Olivia. Once, twice, 10 times. Every call went straight to voicemail. He drove across Denver like someone who had lost his compass, going from her apartment to the market where she bought ingredients to the old shop, where he first met her in her early days. Everywhere was the same silence, the silence of someone too hurt to return. He sat in his car, pressing his forehead against the steering wheel, feeling like a child who had just dropped the most precious thing he ever held. Then a thought sparked. Olivia had once mentioned a place, a small spot she visited every week. Daniel jolted upright, started the engine, and sped toward the community park in Aurora. And there across the sun-dappled lawn he saw her. Not in a chef's coat, not with the hardened steadiness she carried that morning, but Olivia in an old hoodie and faded jeans, standing beside a beat-up portable grill. In front of her was a long line of children in community program shirts, holding paper trays, their eyes lighting up at the smell of hot, sizzling burgers. Olivia smiled at each of them, a smile Daniel had never seen in the restaurant. A real smile. Soft. Unburdened. When a little girl shyly asked for extra cheese, Olivia bent down, straightened the child's collar, and added the extra cheese as if she were giving her something precious. That brief moment made Daniel's chest tighten. The chef he had just lost was someone who cooked every dish as if she were caring for something small and fragile, and he had pushed her out of the place that should have been hers. When the children dispersed, Olivia cleaned the grill alone, scrubbing away grease with the tired patience of someone who had done heavy work for too many years. Daniel walked toward her, but she did not look at him. Only the evening breeze caught a strand of her hair. "I did not expect you to find this place." Her voice was hoarse but steady. "I looked for you everywhere. I did not want to be found." Her words were colder than the wind cutting across the park. Daniel opened his mouth, but Olivia continued, still not facing him. "So, what do you want now? An apology? An explanation? Or did you just come to see how far I have fallen?" Daniel felt each word slice into him. He took a step forward. "I am not here to justify anything. I am here because I owe you the truth." Olivia set the grill tongs down and turned to look at him. Her eyes were not angry, but hurt, a deep hurt that made Daniel look away. "The truth," she asked. "The truth is that you watched me. You suspected me of stealing. You brought the auditors down on me. You stood there while I was forced to resign in humiliation. That is your truth." Daniel swallowed hard, forcing his voice to stay steady. "I was wrong. Completely wrong. You were wrong, but you still let me stand alone in front of them. Wrong, yet you said nothing. You were wrong in the most cowardly way possible." Daniel nodded. "No excuses? No defense? You are right. I was a coward." Olivia was silent. Daniel looked at her hands. The old burn scars, the hardened calluses from years of holding pans, and he understood that no apology, however sincere, could repair what had already shattered. Olivia lowered her gaze to the old wooden picnic table. "I spent 3 years keeping Hartley's flame alive." Her voice trembled. I thought I was saving a shared dream. But it turns out I was the only one who believed it was still worth saving. Daniel wanted to reach out and touch her shoulder, but did not dare. I am sorry. She shook her head, a bitter smile flickering across her lips. Sorry does not change anything, Daniel. She picked up the container of utensils and began to walk away. Daniel called out more desperately than he had ever sounded in his life. Olivia, wait. She stopped. She did not turn back. I have nothing left to say to you. And then her final words, soft as smoke, but heavy as stone. Some flames are meant to go out. She walked away, leaving Daniel standing alone in the empty park, feeling like someone who had just lost something so precious he would never find it again. The evening moved on, and Daniel stayed there for a long, long time, until darkness settled completely, and he still had not moved. Because for the first time, he understood clearly he had not only lost Olivia, he had lost himself. Daniel returned to the restaurant like a shadow, carrying the hollow emptiness that had stretched through an entire sleepless night. He was no longer there to be Eddie, no longer there to mop floors or pretend to be invisible. He came because he had nowhere else to go, because every path in his mind led back to the same truth: Olivia was gone. And he had let it happen. The kitchen that morning no longer held her quiet laugh, no longer echoed with her steady voice, calling out orders that made the entire line move like a machine with a heartbeat. What remained was a heavy silence, the kind that settles like ash after a fire. Daniel held the broom without realizing his hand was trembling. Each slow scrape across the floor sounded tired, like the ragged breathing of someone trying to stay alive after a devastating blow. The image of Olivia walking away, her final words. Some flames are meant to go out, wrapped around him like a rope, tightening with every breath. Near midday, the restaurant opened for customers, but even though the dishes were made exactly according to company procedure, the flavor was so flat Daniel could not swallow it. Both staff and customers could feel that something essential had vanished. Not technique, not ingredients, but the soul. Sitting at table 6, the same table where guests once cried because Olivia had brought back a lost taste, Daniel lowered his head and touched the cold plate as if he were the last guilty person alive. He pulled out his phone and opened his messages, his 27th text to Olivia in 2 days. Still no answer. Realizing he was trapped in a loop of despair, Daniel stood and left the restaurant, driving aimlessly through the city like someone lost inside his own life. It was late at night when his car finally stopped on a small street where warm yellow lights reflected off puddles of leftover rain. It was the place Olivia once said she bought her handcrafted spices every Sunday. Daniel entered the shop with a fragile hope, asking the owner if she had been there. The owner simply shook his head. Olivia had not come since the previous week. Daniel stepped back outside, standing under the awning as the rain hit the pavement, feeling the world shrink until it was no bigger than his own shadow. The rain slapped against his face, as if trying to wash away a disguise he had worn for far too long. He was no longer Daniel Hartley, the powerful executive, no longer the man running a restaurant chain, no longer someone deserving of a second chance. He was just a man who had lost the only thing that mattered and was now teetering on the edge of regret. All he had left were memories. Memories of Olivia smiling while testing a new dish. Memories of her sacrificing her paychecks to buy ingredients. Memories of her standing firm in front of Greg, protecting Noah like an older sister. Memories of her fiercely guarding the flavor he had created, then abandoned. Each memory was a blade turning in his chest, reminding him just how badly he had failed. When night fully settled, Daniel drove back to the restaurant by instinct, as if afraid that without anchoring himself to something familiar, he might vanish altogether. The restaurant was closed with only a faint kitchen light, glowing like the last breath of someone fading away. He sat alone at table 6, drowning in silence, feeling emptiness spread through him like an oil stain. His phone buzzed. An email from the board. They were preparing to vote at sunrise to shut down the Denver branch. He gripped the phone so tightly his hands shook, feeling the ground beneath him split open. No Olivia. No soul. No hope. Even though he had gone undercover to investigate, Daniel now knew what he had found was not operational failure. It was not a broken system. It was the harsh truth that he had built an empire with no room for a heart. And the only person who still carried that heart had walked away. That night, in the empty dining room, Daniel realized the greatest battle he faced was not with the board, not with the failing restaurant, but with himself. The man who had forgotten the most important truth: no one can run a dream if they no longer believe in it. And if he did not find a way to speak with Olivia before sunrise, everything would truly be lost. Daniel walked into the restaurant the next morning no longer in a janitor's uniform, but in the gray suit that once symbolized the power he held, though now it felt heavy on his shoulders like a load of stone. He asked the entire staff to gather in the middle of the dining room. No one understood what was happening, only the growing unease spreading across their faces like an electric shock. Greg appeared looking confused, still trying to maintain a false sense of authority, while Noah stood tucked behind the others, pale as if he had just seen disaster approaching. Daniel stood before them, and for the first time since founding Hartley's Flame, he spoke the truth he had kept hidden. "For the past 2 weeks I have been working here, not as the owner," he said. "I was Eddie the janitor you saw every night." The room erupted into whispers, wide eyes, and stunned breaths. Greg froze as if the world had flipped upside down. Daniel continued, his voice steady but heavy, with a pain he no longer wished to hide. "I came because I thought someone was sabotaging this restaurant. I thought someone was stealing, changing recipes, hiding things. I was wrong." He turned on the projector, revealing a dim, warm-toned photo from the year 2014, he and Olivia standing side by side, smiling brightly at the opening of the very first location. Then came an image of the original recipe card, the words he had written by hand, and Olivia's pencil notes scribbled in the margins. A soft gasp rose from somewhere in the crowd. "The person I suspected was not a saboteur," Daniel said, voice deepening. "That person was Olivia Marquez. She was the one keeping the soul of Hartley's Flame alive when I was the one who lost it." Greg jumped in, "Sir, she." But Daniel turned sharply, his gaze cutting deeper than any kitchen knife. "You are fired, effective immediately." Noah's mouth fell open. A few staff craned their necks. Greg stammered in protest, but Daniel shut him down with one sentence that sliced the room into silence. "You did exactly what I used to ask for, and that is precisely why you no longer belong at Hartley's Flame." Daniel turned back to the staff. "I am resigning as CEO. The board will receive notice this afternoon. But before I step down, I want to fix the one thing that still has a chance to be saved." He displayed a new proposal on the screen: increased kitchen budget, full creative autonomy for chefs at every location, restoration of the original recipes, and a new position: Culinary Creative Director, reserved for Olivia. Everything good that remains here comes from her. The entire room fell silent, as if the restaurant itself was holding its breath. Daniel pulled out his phone and dialed. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. Voicemail. He swallowed hard and put it on speaker. Olivia, I'm sorry, not because I watched you, but because I forgot why we started. You fought alone while I hid in the dark. If there is a chance, even just one, please come back. When the message sent, he lowered the phone, his heart hollow, like someone who had wagered everything on a single fragile hope. And the restaurant stood still in that heavy silence, waiting to see if the flame they had lost still had a path back home. Daniel sat alone in the empty dining room. After lunch, his shadow stretched long across the floor, the shape of a man who had lost his sense of direction. 3 weeks had passed since Olivia left, and though the press sang his praises as the undercover boss who saved his restaurant, Daniel felt only as if he were standing on the edge of 2 cliffs on one side, a reputation being restored on the other, a heart left behind in a place he could no longer reach. The board had accepted his resignation, kept him as a silent shareholder, while the new CEO began restructuring everything in the way Olivia had once fought for. But Denver, the last lung of the soul of Hartley's flame, was unsteady, exhausted, and empty. No one could recreate Olivia's marinade. No one could replicate the way she made guests feel truly cared for. The dishes were still good, but emotionless. The procedures were flawless, but cold. Every day, Daniel sat at table 6, ordered the ribeye, cut a small piece, then pushed the plate away. The taste could not touch him anymore, because he knew what was missing the one who had kept the fire burning for 3 years, the one he had let slip away. Then, one morning, as if fate wanted to mock him, Daniel arrived at the restaurant before dawn. The kitchen door was slightly open, and he heard the sound of a knife tapping on the cutting board, a rhythm so familiar it awoke old memories. His heart pounded. He stepped into the kitchen and saw what he thought would never happen. Olivia was there seasoning each steak with the same dark mixture he had first seen when he was pretending to be the janitor. The white light reflected off her face, making her seem both painfully familiar and entirely new. Without looking at him, Olivia said, "Tommy told me you eat ribeye every day and never finish it." Her voice was steady, not cold. "So I came to see if what you're looking for is still here." Daniel moved closer, each word slipping out as if afraid to break this fragile moment. "I'm not looking for a dish. I'm looking for you." Olivia set down the jar of spices, only then turning to face him. There was no anger, no accusation, only the caution of someone too deeply hurt to trust again easily. "I haven't decided anything," she said quietly. "I came back to see if Hartley's flame has truly changed, or if it only changes when the spotlight is on." Daniel did not try to explain. He simply walked to the corner, picked up the mop, and began to clean each patch of floor, not out of disguise, but because it was the only way left to show he no longer stood above anyone. They worked in silence, but it was an honest silence, no longer heavy like before. When the first steak was finished, Olivia set the plate on the pass, signaling for Daniel to taste it. He cut a piece, brought it to his lips, and as the flavor unfolded on his tongue, Daniel closed his eyes. It was memory. It was pain. It was hope. It was a reminder of the man he used to be. When he opened his eyes, Olivia was watching him, no longer avoiding, not yet fully open, but enough for him to know the door was not completely closed. "It's not perfect," she said, "but it's real." Daniel set down his fork, his voice rough with emotion. "And that's enough." For the first time in many months, he believed that Hartley's flame and he himself might still have a chance to begin again. The story of Daniel and Olivia shows us that true power doesn't come from your position or the money you possess, but from your ability to see the value in others, to take responsibility, and to protect the soul of what you have built before it is too late. A leader might run an entire empire, but if they forget compassion and sincerity, every system will eventually crack, and in the end, they themselves will be the one to pay the price. Like and subscribe to join us for more stories that awaken the heart where human values are always placed above profit and appearances. And leave a comment with the phrase, "Keep the flame," to remind one another that sometimes just one steadfast person is enough to bring a seemingly extinguished fire back to life.